I got trouble with the insane game freak. Hey, it's trouble with the insane game freak. Hey, it's trouble in that same game. That's an game freak. Hey, I got that with another one. So what I deem to be an interesting conversation is this conversation about wokeness and anti-wokeness and the problems with each, but really no one says because wokeness has been bastardized as a term. Therefore, we need to discuss it to understand what wokeness is. So the original form of the term wokeness was really more lean into the idea of being awake to see things as they really are, not what you want them to be. That there were things going on in society and in various industries that pointed to things being more nefarious or things that were hidden behind the true meaning of things. And when someone told you to stay awake, brother, or just be aware, that you were looking beyond just the straight physical. The funny thing is that is still kind of the same thing, except the difference is now is that because we don't understand how contexts work, we're just looking at straight physical. So using, I'll say, movies as the example, back in the day, there was a lot of discrimination based on color, based on gender, based on race. And a lot of people would pretend like, oh no, it's because you have all these white actors that are just more prone to the part. Even though you had females and black people and other various racial groups or indigenous groups that weren't properly represented. And if they were, it was never in a positive light, because of the agenda that was going on at the time and the mentality of the people at that time. And I think at that time it was perfectly fair to tell someone to be awake. The problem is that there's an unacknowledgement that those things are still happening today, or if they're happening the same way. So as a result, there's an inherent distrust in modern society because of it. When it comes to being aware of what's going on in your society or in your culture, there's a misunderstanding that those things are exactly the same or if they haven't been the same since a certain point in time. And so what happens is that people who think everything is overly woke now don't understand that is not intrinsically true. And it was never true that everything has an agenda and was woke. Just like everything back then wasn't inherently trying to be one way or another. The problem is that the way people view things as being woke now is based off of the over inclusion of certain groups, whether it's based off gender, race, sex, whatever. And that those things are the forefront of the conversation instead of just making an interesting story with interesting characters. Now, for people to pretend like that there isn't some directors and studios' goals to put more X specific people into movies or televisions or games is a little disingenuous, because you know openly, because some people have just outright said it, we need more diversity. The problem that comes is that people don't understand that diversity by itself isn't the problem. Diversity is not a bad thing. The problem is that when you tell someone to be awake or in woke culture, what you're telling them is to look beyond what they just see. The problem is that people can't do that effectively because there will always be some level of doubt in their minds. So they go off of what they see. So what happens nowadays when it comes to someone calling something woke is that the only thing you know that is for sure a goal is more diversity. But once again, diversity by itself isn't the problem, but it is one of the key ways you can tell when something is intentionally going out of its way to be more about the people who are acting than the content that they're making, right? It becomes this thing where it's like, I want more African Americans in TV and film. Cool. But then the show and TV just becomes about black people and not a story. It's just black people or people who are non-binary or just more women in a leading role. None of these things are intrinsically wrong within themselves, but there's a difference between a movie that has black people or trans people or female leads in it and then movies that are only about them being black, trans, or women. It's not the same thing. Having a great story that just so happens that the main character is black is cool. A story where the main character being black is the whole point of the story is not cool, because then it's not a story at that point. You've just turned it into identity politics, which is what people are concerning themselves with. The problem is those are like the most visual representations of knowing, hey, this must be woke, because if it was a white man, you know for a fact they aren't trying to be woke because it's a white man in front, right? And it isn't like we don't have millions of movies of those, right? Right. So the identifier for people thinking that things is woke is seeing a race swap character, a non-binary or just non-traditional white male character, and a woman as a main character. This is disingenuous though, because once again, having those three things being in the front of your cover doesn't make it automatically woke. But because we don't have any other identifier, that's what people use. And people online start making disingenuous arguments, knowing that that's no way that could just easily be the case. I think one of their latest examples would be the Fallout show, right? The Fallout show, before it even came out, you found out, hey, she's going to be the main character, right? We're going to have a female main character. And everyone online who was on this part of the mentality was like, obviously, they're trying to be woke with Fallout. Fallout wasn't about the gender of the main character. It was about the story, right? But look, they put this unattractive female on the front cover. The only way you would truly know if a show is woke is if you went and watched the show and realized the show doesn't care about the show or the plot. It cares about the woman understanding that she's great. That's a good example of woke propaganda in film and in TV. When you have a film that's about a woman who struggles and has a problem and she's trying to do better but also fight her own insecurities, that's perfectly fine. But when you have a film that the whole point of the film is literally just because you're a woman doesn't mean you're not already great, and it's not like a biopic that's talking about the struggles of feminism or female struggles in a certain time period, then you know that one's just trying to push an agenda and doesn't really care about the source material. But you know the problem with that? The only way you would know that to be true is if you went out and you watched the material. So how are people who were looking at Fallout going, see female on the cover, woke? How would you know that when the show wasn't even out yet? But then it came out and everyone loves it. That's the part of the disingenuousness I mean. We're using these parameters, and I get they're the most obvious ones, female, race, gender, but like, that's not enough to condemn a show, and you're creating a false narrative, and then you're raising a community that for all intents and purposes thinks that if you see a black person on the cover, or a woman, or someone who considers themselves non-binary, that automatically means the show is trash. You can have a great show with all those types of people in your content. But when you have, and the reality is that it boils down to extremists. Now, on the other side of the coin, we're not going to pretend like there aren't certain shows, TVs, and video games that don't openly just say all they care about is diversity and they don't care about the property. I think the Velma show is a good example of that. A show that cares more about the identity politics than it does about the content of the show. Eternals is another movie that I think cared more about its identity politics than it did about the quality of the movie. Hence why the movie is trash. And once again, it's a misunderstanding that one doesn't inherently mean the other, but because it's easier to see, oh, there's a white man on the cover, obviously there's no identity politics in there, when that could easily still be the case. We've seen plenty of films that do that goofy thing where the main character is downplayed because there's a woman that needs to be brought up, and the woman has no flaws, and there's no relatability, and there's no plot progression with that character. The only thing, like, what was it? Doctor Strange does that with America Chavez. It's literally the main character, Doctor Strange, doesn't really matter in his own story, and the real point of the story is to acknowledge how great America Chavez is. Captain Marvel's another character who suffers in the same way, where it's like the character has no intrinsic flaws, and the whole point of her story is realizing how great she is. I can't, even though we recognize there's no relatability to the character at that point. So why would it be good? But she's female representation. We're not going to sit here and pretend like Marvel doesn't have a weird string of all girl, only female heroes that we're only pushing, and half of them either don't make sense in the role or the way they are pushed to the forefront is the same. Well, women can be great too. And I'm like, not every story can be that. Not saying you can't have any story that's like that, but not every story is just women can be great too. Black people can be great too. Trans people can be great too. I think the most disingenuous part of the other side is not acknowledging that if there can be agenda back in the 1920s and the 1930s and the 1940s and then the 1950s and the 1960s and the 1970s and the 1980s and the 1990s and the 2000s and 2010s, why all of a sudden in 2024 can there not still be an agenda? The irony of the whole situation is that the problem that we both have when it comes to wokeness and agendas in any type of our media or just in society is that extremists will blow out the argument to the point where people think it's irrelevant on both sides of the coin. So people think there is no agenda, there is no other plan, there is no thing to be aware of, and we think of it as a joke. Wokeness, I think, will always be a problem until we kind of mellow out again. We're not there where we need to be socially, but it's a work. We're getting there. Things are happening. Stuff's moving. It's just gonna take some time. I just want people to maintain one particular thing moving forward. Keep your mind open. Don't automatically shoot someone out just because they might be talking a little crazy. Because even if the majority of what they say is crazy, there is a nugget of truth that could be buried in there. So keep your eyes, your ears, and your heart wide open. Catch you guys later. Peace.